Okay, so the Progressive Era, 1890 to 1920. The Progressive Era falls under three different presidents: President McKinley, President Teddy Roosevelt, and President Woodrow Wilson. Not the same Wilson as in the Tom Hanks movie. Now, McKinley was more business-oriented, and Roosevelt and Wilson are really considered the pair of back-to-back progressives presidents. Now, progressives have one thought. Progressives believe that mankind, the lives of humans, that man can be improved by government. Step by step, little things can be made to progressively improve the lives of most people. Now, there were a lot of issues going on in the United States at this time. Very serious issues, and we've talked about these in previous video lectures. A lot of big business out there, a lot of monopolies, a lot of trusts. If you recall what we talked about monopolies and trusts in the Second Industrial Revolution, these corporations were very large and very powerful. Because of that, the leaders of this had great wealth. In fact, they were called the Gilded Age because they were so wealthy. They built these huge houses, almost like palaces of the old aristocracies of Europe and the kings and queens and princes and stuff. People like Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan and Carnegie amassed huge fortunes and used that money, sometimes for good, like Carnegie did, but often just to kind of get more and more wealth and more power. That led to corrupt politicians, because business loves having politicians that they can control, because that way monopolies and trusts can get laws passed which are in their favor to allow them to maximize profits. So, corrupt politicians leading to political machines in both cities and states. One political party, for example, the Democratic Party in North Carolina, would take over a city or a state, and they would run it, and all their friends would get nice jobs. They would elections would be sold to their friends. Political positions would be given to cronies and friends of theirs and things like that. And these were some of the issues. The solution from the progressives, one was called the Interstate Commerce Commission. Now, interstate commerce is regulated by Congress in Article 1, Section A, Paragraph 3, which is called the Commerce Clause. But they never had an administrative agency to try to control the issue of interstate commerce. Now, this means commerce that goes on between various states, and monopolies and trusts operated across the United States through all the states. Therefore, the federal government had a legitimate ability to regulate them and make sure that they were doing things the way they should. Another thing that was passed was what's called the 16th Amendment. Because people were so wealthy, a new, more progressive form of taxation had to be constitutionally amended, and that was called a progressive income tax. And a progressive income tax can be summed up with this phrase: the more you make, the more they take. So the more wealthy would pay more taxes instead of the poor people paying taxes. The poor people ain't got no money anyway, right? So the rich people ended up having to pay a lot more taxes, sometimes as high as 80 to 90% of their wealth. Another thing to fix politics was something called the 17th Amendment. Now, originally, when the Constitution was written, the senators from the various states were appointed by the state legislatures or the governor to represent the interest of that state in the federal government. This was part of something called federalism, because the states created the federal government and the states decided they needed a say in what the federal government did. Progressives believe that all that did was allow local politicians to appoint their friends to the U.S. Senate. And so they were appointed by state government. But with the 17th Amendment, this changed this and allowed for the election of senators by direct popular vote. One more thing that was very important during the Progressive Era was to try to get rid of this idea that politicians could appoint their friends to all the nice jobs. Something called the Pendleton Act. The Pendleton Act created a civil service for government employees that people would get a job with the government not based on who you know, but what you know. It was an issue of merit. If you could prove you could do the job and you knew what you were doing, then you could get a government job, and you didn't have to have a friend who had a friend who knew the governor, right? It wasn't any more of that stuff. The Pendleton Act. Now, progressives want to fix government. One thing they came up with was called the Wisconsin idea, and most of these came from the state of Wisconsin, which was a very progressive state. Wisconsin came up with 4 ideas to really affect government. The one was called a primary election. Now, almost every state uses primary elections, but it didn't used to be that way. With a primary election, the people get to vote for who the party candidate is. Like you have three people who want to be the governor of, say, North Carolina, and they're all Democrats. Well, they have a primary election where the people can choose this guy or this guy or this guy or this woman, like Beverly Perdue. And so the people get to vote who's going to be the party's nominee to become that political office holder, and not the bosses choosing, the political bosses. Another thing Wisconsin came up with, a ballot initiative. A ballot initiative is where the people can insist on a law being passed so that it's not left up to only the politicians deciding what the laws will be for the rest of us. No, we have a ballot initiative that we can make sure see that a law can get put on the books. Another thing is called a referendum. Sometimes politicians will pass a law and the people don't want that law. And so with a referendum, the people get to vote on which bill becomes a law. You see, what this does is it kind of stops the politicians from making backroom deals. Yeah, you vote for this one, I'll vote for that one, and we'll both get what we want. And then the people, with the people as far as politicians are concerned, but a referendum allows the people to vote on what's going to be a law. Fourth, recall elections. So that you can get rotten politicians can be forced out of office before their term is up. And this actually happened recently in the state of Wisconsin, where people were complaining about the Governor Scott of Wisconsin, and they forced a recall election. And the idea about this is no more lifetime politicians. And that's a good thing. When they're a politician too long, it just causes nothing but trouble. Now, like I said earlier, the U.S. had some very serious problems. In the cities, an influx of mass immigration from different places in Europe. More Irish came, and this time during the 1880s and 90s, Italians came, Greeks, Germans, Jewish people, and a lot of folks from Eastern Europe like Poland and Romania and places like that, and of course Russian. And they crowded into the cities, and cities like New York and Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and places like that. Overcrowded cities led to gang and crime problems, sanitation and clean workers. A lot of these apartment buildings they would move into had one bathroom per floor, and maybe 10 families had to share one bathroom. And often they didn't have clean water to drink, which of course led to outbreaks of disease, dysentery and cholera and things like that. It got so bad that in Chicago, 50% infant mortality rate. Now what that means is that is the percentage of babies that die before their first birthday. In Chicago during this era, because of the overcrowded cities and disease and things like that, 1 out of every 2 infants died before they reached their first birthday. And the factories, things we've already talked about. Child labor, 70 hours work weeks at low pay, dangerous working conditions, and one of the worst was something called the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. This was a sewing factory that made shirts, and because the management wanted to keep people from coming in, especially union organizers from coming in, they locked all the doors. And then a fire broke out. This was like an 8-story building. Fire broke out on the top floor and started to burn its way down, and all the people that were in there were trapped. And somewhere, I think about 150 people either burned to death or jumped off the roof in order to not burn to death. This was a horrible thing. And when they did an investigation of it, they realized how dangerous those work conditions were. Now, one of the worst was unsafe food, especially in the meat packing industry. Cows and pigs. The packing houses, because they were a trust and a monopoly and they had their politicians in their pockets, they got away with almost no laws whatsoever regulating what animals they could sell. And they were selling diseased animals as meat, which means that the people in the city would buy that meat and get horribly sick. This was exposed from a very important book called The Jungle, written by a guy by the name of Upton Sinclair. He actually went to work in one of these meat houses in order to do the research for his book. He was called a muckraker. someone who rakes the muck like out of a barn or something, right? Because him and people like those journalists like that would find all these things that were going wrong, especially with politicians and big business and stuff like that, and they would publish them in the newspaper, and so the public would be made aware of it, and they would put pressure on the politicians to finally do something. Muckrakers, The Jungle, Upton Sinclair. If you ever want to read a horrible book, you'll probably become a vegetarian after you read that book. Now, here's the deal. Reforms were needed. What was really needed was not just reforms, but a reformer. A politician who was needed, who would be unafraid of the trusts and the big business, and who would be unafraid of their toady little politicians, and that's who we're going to talk about in the next video lecture.